Kelly.
And I'm Kyle Thompson.
And I'm Esri.
And I'm Jake.
And you're listening to General Intellect Unit / Swampside Chats. As we're back in the studio. The Swamp is with the Unit, and the Unit is with the Swamp, to talk about a book, Norbert Wiener's The Human Use of Human Beings, specifically the first edition from 1950. Because the second edition was quite heavily revised after the FBI basically came around his house and told him to shut his trap or they would kill him.
Knock knock.
Yeah, so it's quite a bit less radical.
That's not an exaggeration, by the way. That might sound like one, but no, that's actually what happened.
So they literally openly threatened to kill him. It wasn't just like a strong arm kind of conversation.
It scared him enough that he had to rewrite the book, but who knows what kind of nudge.
Okay. I mean, I guess any visit from the FBI is probably going to freak you out a little bit.
Yeah, it's not a great thing to happen. But so the second edition onwards is, I think, actually a stronger book. This first edition is kind of not particularly well written, but the first edition is more radical, and so that's kind of why we're reading it. Okay, let's do some first impressions. Jake, what do you think of this?
Well, I mean, having read it, I guess there must have been some serious Cold War hysteria or something causing them to go and visit him for something like this, which is, I think, pretty mild. All things I was expecting to find, I don't know, the blueprints to the saucer they found outside Area 51 or something, like some real juice. Instead, I just found kind of a liberal, pessimistic stuff peppered in with some really interesting things on early cybernetics, and there's some stuff that seems to point towards machine learning, and some musings on the problems of actually existing socialism. The book was a little all over the place. I probably didn't pull as much out of it as you all did, but I probably don't have the same kind of STEM background or computer-based background. But it was an easy enough thing to read. Yeah, I give it a C+.
Yeah, I think that's probably where it is. It's patchy. Let's say that. The bits that are interesting are very interesting, but it's quite patchy. Esri, what's your take?
Yeah, let's see. I'm doing a big bit of what's called the hermeneutics of suspicion here, and saying that a lot of this anti-fascism stuff that the book is loaded with, and is a sign of crypto small c, a communist kind of longing in the soul. And I say in the soul because clearly, what you actually see written, we're wondering, why would the FBI care about this so much, considering how far out of his way he goes to call the Soviet state totalitarian religion, essentially. But there's quite a bit of radical thought here. There's a critique of the ideology of progress that actually exempts communists, which is not a usual. That's not the usual critique of modernity and progress, which I think maybe he unfairly exempts the existing communists. But that's always an asterisk to me of, why are you walling off something other than the nominal usage of this word? What are you hiding? Because I think I know what you got, because I got it too. Clearly, cybernetics as a whole has a sort of para-dialectical character. This explicitly, even though he takes a shot at Marx's read of Hegel's logic as being, the St. Thomas Aquinas flipping Aristotle's logic and comparing its role in Jesuit theology as part of the totalitarian aspect, right? I just feel like this is a guy that has powerful socialist longings in 1950s America. The House of Un-American Activities Committee is around knocking on doors. It's not just something cool you can do as an Instagram model to be a communist at this time. So I perhaps wrongly read that into a lot of what he's saying here, but I'm okay with being wrong if that's what it is, because it's front loaded with critiques of imperialism and, I mean, civilization. There's a critique of civilization and a defense of so-called primitive peoples that I don't normally see, and it could be that there's like a missing link for me between, you know, something that an influential text that I haven't read that are links in the chain here. But I have a feeling that some of the primitivists, like, you know, Ted Kaczynski, probably had read this book in Berkeley in the 1960s or whatever, and that it had a stamp on his thought, although, again, taking that in a reactionary direction instead of this interesting, critical, humanist direction. So I was, yeah, I mean, I share the opinion that it's not like a very well-written book, but there's about 100 pages of this, like, that are politically, like, so far-seeing for that time period in America, or maybe even anywhere. And also, I don't think I've read an earlier description of machine learning. There's a sort of treatise on the implications of game theory that, you know, prefigures the AI accelerationist God that, you know, the accelerationist God AI that keeps Elon Musk up at night. There's so much here. This is a very impressive book. I can see why maybe it's not read as much as it should be, but if there's some way we can splice the radical shit back into one of the better formed copies of this book, like, you know, sort of do a George Lucas special edition, where you stitch together like some of the cool early cut deleted scenes with the newest CGI. I think this would be like well worth reading because it presents a vision that is absent from, you know, actually existing communism, even actually existing like cybernetic crypto Stalinist shit. Like, it's really missing this strange non-vitalist beating heart that Wiener brings to the subject matter. It's been a while since I read a book that, like, kind of hit me in the soul as much as this, even though I speed read like a quarter of it.
Yeah, I think I'm in a very similar place. Like, it's I'm on board with a lot of that, and then with the caveat, yeah, it's 100 good pages out of 200 and something. So can't win them all. Kyle, what's your take?
Yeah, I am always interested in this generation of intellectuals. A lot of my doctoral work in Japan was studying about this generation of intellectuals, sort of coming out of the 30s, the kind of communist tendencies or socialist tendencies that existed at that time, and then through the war, the involvement with the security state, and finally the chill of the Cold War, which basically suppresses radical thought for, like, in especially in sort of like STEM related fields, for maybe about 20 to 30 years, possibly even longer than that. So I find this generation always an interesting one to come back to and see what they say. You know, I can see how many of these kinds of pessimistic treaties were written at the time because they were facing down really quite a situation that gave them cause for despair. I guess the one that I would usually point to is like One Dimensional Man. Came out later, but, you know, similar background, right? Someone from the security state who basically gets fed up with the way things are going and writes a big sort of diagnosis of civilization and that kind of like civilization and its discontent mold. So my feelings about this specific text, I think it's not at all illegitimate to point to those sort of communist yearnings. Wiener very explicitly defends the principles of Marxism, even if he considers the methods and structures of the project to be broken and fall into the Catholic pattern. I'm interested to talk about that section a little bit later, how much this falls into sort of anti-Catholicism as like standard American discourse. But I think some of the stuff he says has good points. I mean, I think a lot of us have histories with Catholicism, so we can probably get into that a bit. I think it's his general sort of civilizational diagnosis I find interesting, especially looking back. This is what he saw, what actually happened, what came of this situation he was diagnosing. That interests me quite a bit to see, like, well, we'll get into it. I have some specific points I want to talk about a little bit more. But for the most part, the book is a lot of musings by someone who is quite an intellectual insider, an academic insider, someone who comes from that sort of security state background, has been a part of sort of the tremendous technological developments of the Second World War, and is kind of like making a case for communication being a principle that is general to many areas of life. I think basically that is not a controversial statement anymore. A lot of the things he says in the book are really dated. And I therefore found most of this book to not be very interesting at all. I think it was a snooze for most of me. Like I literally fell asleep reading it quite a few times. But when I got to the last chapter, I was like, oh yeah, like this is actually really solid. This is like an interesting read. This is an interesting take. And it's not that the stuff he's written was just like inherently bad. It's just he wasn't a specialist in any of the areas he was writing about. And it's like, I don't want to read something by a non-specialist about information in like sort of scientific fields that is like 60 years out of date. Like that's quite dull to me.
Yeah, absolutely.
Unless it is like a very specific intellectual project of like tracing an intellectual genealogy, which is not what we're really doing here. The front and back are really good. He sort of lays out a lot of things that Beer would later take up in interesting ways. That sort of civilizational diagnosis I appreciate quite a bit. But for the most part, it was a lot of rough and not many gems in the middle.
Yep, totally. There's a big saggy middle here, which we're going to skim over. We're going to focus on the first and last couple of chapters.
How did you feel, Shane? What are your general comments?
I read the second edition quite a while ago, and I liked it. That's a fairly tight book, and I think is a bit more sophisticated than this one. It's a bit of a shame that he had to rewrite it and strip out the radical stuff, because that is obviously missing. So, for example, like chapter 12 is gone from all subsequent editions. Like the last chapter, it just doesn't reappear, and that's the one where he explicitly calls out the FBI. So you wonder why that might have gone. So that one had piqued my interest anyway. But then also in the first chapter, like a lot of the kind of radical stuff and the radical opposition to the sort of capitalist machine subjugation of humanity, all that's stripped out. So it becomes a more sort of, I think, balanced philosophical work, but at the expense of all of its sort of stuff. But I'm in general agreement here. I think I'm as enthusiastic as Esri about the like what is hinted at behind the scenes, because I think this guy seems to fit into a category of people like scientists and cyberneticians of the mid-century who were basically socialist-ish or whatever in their commitments, but they were scared shitless by the Soviet Union for like they were like actually like really repulsed by what was going down there, and for good reason. But also found themselves kind of ran out of town at home and kind of developed the good sense to keep their heads down. And, you know, but then you can sort of see what's bubbling behind the surface. I also agree with Kyle, like a lot of this is just kind of fairly drab. The middle chapters especially. Like, Wiener did regard himself as a kind of boy wonder, or whatever the proper term for that is. He was kind of a bit full of himself and was a bit too willing to get into fields that he kind of didn't really know what he was talking about. There are some predictions here that are very, very, very accurate. Like he calls a lot of stuff, but then there's stuff that's just kind of waffle, and it's like, meh, shrug.
Well, it's just like he's not doing something that was overly unusual for the time. Like the role of the scientist at the time was quite different from what it is now. And so, like, I don't find that stuff to be like, oh, he's just, like, unusually crank. Or, like,
sure.
You know, he's self-aggrandizing here. It's just more like, this is a thing people don't really do anymore. It's interesting to see it done, but I also see why it isn't done anymore. In a context where, like, our understanding of these fields is far deeper than it was at that point.
Indeed. Jake, you had something?
I was going to say, what you were saying about him seeing himself as a boy wonder, you very much get that impression just from the way he writes.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Apparently, I have not an autobiography, whatever the one is, a biography of his somewhere on a shelf. And I think it does sort of go over this kind of thing that like he was, even in school, he was like this, a prodigy, that's the word I was looking for. And he was like, you know, up through the ranks and that kind of shit. And he seemed to have a pretty high opinion of himself. I mean, a fair amount of it are well earned, and a fair amount of it kind of not as well. There's a funny thing where his first book, Cybernetics, Control and Communication in the Animal and the Machine, comes out at about the same time as Claude Shannon's information theory, or the mathematical theory of information. And there's a lot of parallels, but like where Shannon looked at that and was like, huh, that's interesting. And, you know, I should talk to this Wiener guy. Wiener was kind of like, actually said that like, oh, you know, it's a parallel discovery. And he kind of like tried to get some of the credit for like Shannon stuff or something. He was very, like a kind of a prickly guy in some ways. A bit too full of himself. Not exactly the credit, but like, you know, he was like, oh no, I like, because everyone was fawning over Claude Shannon's work. Yeah. And he was like, oh no, I totally did the same thing. And he kind of did, but like, don't say it, you know what I mean? Like,
yeah. That's he should understand by his own musings on intellectual property how how, you know,
he's the meme of the guy in third place spraying champagne all over himself.
That's gonna be the cover art for this episode.
But again, like, not what he was doing there, not uncommon for this time at all among these people. Like, it's, you know, these were luminaries, and they all wanted to stay in the spotlight. And, you know, sometimes it even came down to like national things, right? Like with the whole invention of linear programming. Was it a Soviet thing? Was it an American thing? Like, yeah, he's just kind of one of those at the top of the academic game in the kind of public eye and participating in that sort of vanity contest.
Yeah. Okay.
Well, but, echoing in my head whenever Wiener was mentioning specialization and that sort of thing was Bordiga's critique of science as a sort of nominal body, and how as things got more complicated and scientists became more specialists, it was deprived of its revolutionary unified field Catholic theology, like immortal science character, and therefore it could only be reactionary. This led Bordiga to slogans as "down with science" and "science and religion are buried in the same grave." It's probably where a lot of the primitivists, you know, kind of get their swag from. At least in the case of some of the important ones. But, like, you can see here that this guy is writing on the fringes of when, like, you could reasonably, you know, write a big book of everything and explain every topic to everybody. Because, yeah, like, we'll get into some of his weird Orientalist stuff on linguistics and, you know, his anthropocentric view of language and, you know, a bunch of the things that even if he had, like, a better survey of the material at the time, he wouldn't have said.
Mm-hmm. Indeed. Well, I mean, that sort of those middle chapters on linguistics are not great. So we'll skip over some of those, but we'll mention those bits, right? Because they're definitely worth calling out. So I guess we can get started on the text. So chapter 1 is called "What is Cybernetics?" Notably, this one is kind of rewritten pretty extensively in the second edition. It kind of disappears into 2 or 3 chapters. But he's setting up the problem, right? So he's been studying control engineering and communication processes, and he's found that these processes reveal something of the nature of human behavior because there's something eerily familiar about the way that these cybernetic machines work. And so we're talking about, like, machines that use feedback to adjust their own performance. So the classic example for Wiener is a fire control mechanism for, like, an automated gun turret that the machine is somewhat self-guiding. It uses its own performance to adjust its own performance in this kind of strange feedback loop.
Specifically, this is a thing Wiener invented during the war. It was his, like, wartime job to make this.
Oh, okay. Well, that explains why that's his go-to example. I was like, all right, Wonder Boy.
Yeah, but then later we get the same sort of examples coming up, but, like, in different contexts. So, like, for Ashby, it's all about the thermostat, like the homeostat, right? Like, where the device uses a reading of its own kind of intention versus its actual performance to adjust its own strategies and regulate something, right? So it's the regulation of behavior via communication about oneself and about the world around you. These kinds of systems that are embedded in a world, and they adapt to it by observing things and communicating both internally and externally and stuff like that. And this is strange because it highlights there's something kind of mechanical about human behavior, or that, like, humans as intelligent beings are the sort of apex of this general dynamic that we see in trace amounts in the gun control device and in the thermostat. This then suggests the possibility of replacing human behavior with machines, not just human muscle power replaced with steam engines, but human adaptivity being replaced with cybernetic circuits or even machine learning, right? Then on page 2, he really gets down to it, and this is also stripped out of the subsequent editions, right? So I'll read it. The purpose of this book is both to explain the potentialities of the machine in fields which up to now have been taken to be purely human, and to warn against the dangers of a purely selfish exploitation of these possibilities in a world in which to human beings, human things are all important. That we shall have to change many details of our mode of life in the face of the new machines is certain, but these machines are secondary in all matters of value that concern us, to the proper evaluation of human beings for their own sake, and to their employment as human beings, and not as second-rate surrogates for possible machines of the future. The message of this book, as well as its title, is the human use of human beings. This was interesting to me because, like, in the subsequent editions, all this shit is gone, right? And he never actually mentions what the title is supposed to be about after that. And I always talk the title, the human use of human beings, to be a reference to, like, human domination of other human beings. But he's actually contrasting it because he's a bit of a sort of, like, lib rather than a kind of out-and-out communist, right? He's not going that far. But he's contrasting the human and humane use of human capabilities versus the machinic use of human beings, where humans are treated as cogs rather than intelligent beings in their own right, and they are subjected to a kind of machine intelligence of the market, like the sort of despotic market consciousness subjugates human activity to its own will. This resonates quite a bit with the early chapters of Marx's Capital. Like, I mean, I happen to also be reading, doing a close reading of Capital right now, but yeah, like pretty close parallels here.
Yeah, there's small sections of this book that do touch on the development of the industrial labor process. I would imagine he was working from Capital to some degree, like, lib or not. Like, this is a strain of liberal humanism that is very amenable to, you know, the communist horizon. Like, I mean, when we were talking about, you know, when we were talking about like the limits of scientific discovery, there's a section towards the end of the book where he more or less defends like the sort of Hegelian Fichtean sort of logic of discovery. Like in the Marxist mode, he defends, you know, dialectics in a sense, like as, you know, intellectual freedom doesn't always weave everything together, but when you have real mastery of a topic, you can synthesize all of these seemingly disparate parts. And cybernetics as a whole, but also, you know, explicitly in the language here, is taking, you know, what could be called the law of quantity into quality, you know, like as its first principle. And really, if you really take science seriously, it's pretty much the only dialectical law that you really need to consider. Like this, that, and, you know, an acceptance of that is all over this. It's part of the cybernetic tradition already, but like, this guy read Engels. You know he did. Like...
Yeah, definitely, right. There's something else that jumps out at me here in this whole chapter, because like there's quite a few bits he goes through, like information theory and like machine engineering sort of stuff. But there's a kind of interesting inhuman humanism at work here, because it's a humanism. He's like he wants to point us towards like evaluating human beings as valuable, like dynamic, lively creatures in their own right. But he gets there by a sort of machinic ontology where this thing we call agency is a structural thing that just exists in matter. If matter is configured in certain configurations, it will exhibit agency. And that these feedback circuits are what gives this kind of thing, right? Like that you can see agency in trace amounts in the thermostat and in the fire control device. And when you get to like organisms proper and like intelligent social organisms, you're looking at the same dynamic but amplified fucking crazy amounts. So he's sort of saying like we shouldn't treat human beings as if they were machines, but human beings are extremely advanced machines also. This is the general bias of cybernetics as well, to like value local intelligence, that like matter and like organism is intelligent, and organisms are composed out of stacked intelligences that combine to give more and more emergent intelligence, and that to mistreat a human being as if it were simply a cog would be just a vorpal kind of damage to the ontology, right? You'd be denying all that agency all the way down.
Well, I mean, I guess like part of the reason some of that happens is because you're basically dealing with managing complex systems, and so the more variables you have, the more complex the system is, and the harder it is to manage. So the humanist impulse behind cybernetics, it seems like, is to develop a way in which you can collectively manage these complex systems that doesn't just 100% completely instrumentalize people.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah. I mean, the whole question of human use of human beings does put into question, like, which humans are the subject and which humans are the object there. Like, is it all of us using all of us? Or is it, you know, a class?
I think that's what he's getting at. Like that's what he wants to get at, I think, but he doesn't quite get there, because I don't think he quite has that class analysis right proper, because it still does remind you of that, like, well, which humans? But I think what he's getting at is something like the culture, where it's like there's a general human system that instrumentalizes all of its components to all of their benefit, or whatever.
Well, okay, so like he essentially posits three types of domination in this book, right? There is capitalist domination, which is the domination of what he calls the fifth freedom of the businessman, right? Is the freedom to exploit. There is the domination of the totalitarian organization. So whether that is for him fascist, Catholic, or Marxist, or you know, communist. And then finally, there is the perspective domination by the fascist machine that would, you know, be basically whatever it is, Skynet, what we would come to know as Skynet. So those are the three types of sort of like non-human uses of human beings. And he defends the principle of equality. Or, like, what is it? He says, like, the three basic principles that we need to pay attention to are liberty, fraternity, and equality. And he says the principle of equality is like interesting and useful enough, important enough, that I think it's fair to say when he says the human use of human beings, it's very much a mutual use of each other in an egalitarian way. I did want to say one other thing about sort of the human use of human beings, which is I believe this text is prior to Ashby's Law.
Yes. Not by much.
But he does.
But it's there.
He does very much make an argument that resembles one based on Ashby's Law, which is essentially that human beings, you know, as these kind of like high variety machines, have a certain amount of play and capacity to them, which in human uses of human beings basically try to attenuate, right? Like they just try to attenuate the variety of people down to a common sort of ready-made unit. And so you can definitely see like a prefiguring of like Beer's thinking about human freedom in this text. And I thought that was cool to see, like, yeah, this isn't exactly justified by Ashby, but it very much is writing in the same vein.
It's remarkable how much of that is present so early, right? Because this is the second text ever about cybernetics.
Wow.
Because the first is his first book, Control and Communication in the Animal and the Machine, and the second book, The Human Use of Human Beings, is it's a rewrite that's stripped of all the math to be more like a popular read. This is the second ever book about this shit. In parallel, Ashby and Beer and all these other fucking freaks are reading this stuff and are coming up with their own theories. But it's remarkable how much of that is present here very early.
This is absolutely remarkable. But yeah, because the whole point of his discussion of variety is that the desire to attenuate variety is fascist, essentially. It's fascist Ant-Man. Like, you're trying to turn humanity into a hive, right? Like, and he makes a not so subtle overture that, like, the way that the way that capitalist enterprises are headed with an executive surrounded by yes men, or the way that a bureaucracy, his go-to example is a laboratory, is headed, implies that these people don't actually really love democracy. These people want to attenuate variety as much as possible. Very much implied that capitalism in its, market form and its bureaucratic form has these imminent fascist tendencies to eliminate variety, to shoot the cat in your Beerian terminology.
Absolutely. And I guess maybe, especially for the listeners who are maybe not totally familiar with the cybernetics material, it's worth clarifying that when we say machine and when Norbert Wiener says machine, he doesn't just mean lumps of iron and circuits of silicon and copper. A machine is a structure that exhibits a behavior and exhibits a consistent behavior. So machines can be made out of meat. They can be made out of units of meat, like social machines. Social systems are social machines, and they can also be made out of iron. But the iron machines are a kind of special case of machinic dynamics in general. So that's maybe worth bearing in mind.
And I think this is something that'll come up later in the text, but I think that Wiener hasn't really thought this through as much as he should have. There's a kind of, I guess, like, Enlightenment humanism that is residual in this text, which isn't really consistent with the cybernetic principles that he's advocating. So if we want to make that like sort of Pickering distinction, I would say this is somewhere in between the modern and non-modern ontology, right? Like, there is a kind of anthropocentrism to this text, which is kind of at odds with what you just described.
It's very weird, isn't it? Because like he has that anthropocentrism with language, but then he also says that like language is not an exclusively human thing. Like machines can communicate amongst themselves, but he doesn't extend that to animals very much.
No, it's machines that can also communicate, like with language, and like the behavioral patterns that and phonetic patterns that exist in animals are not language.
So he doesn't drink his own Kool-Aid quite enough. You know?
Like the part that's developed is anti-vitalism. You know what I mean? Like that there isn't this specific life force. There isn't. It's that it's basically patterns all the way down. But
Yeah.
I appreciate somebody that can recognize that and also be like, but on some level, what I'm concerned with is humans. You know, like outside of maybe some ethical vegetarianism or something. Like it kind of weirds me out when people care more about cows or something than people in the third world. So like I don't really have that much of a problem with this inconsistency. Is it inconsistent? Yeah, like he hasn't laid down the framework to justify it. But this is like, it's an inconsistency that comes out of like his many virtues that he's still primarily cared about human life.
I think it's a kind of halfway house on the like the humiliation of humanity or whatever. But like it does turn out that we're not the only agents in the world, but we are still agents.
And
both of those are fine to be true at the same time, right?
And this conversation is carried out between a specific type of agent. Like it's and it's a conversation between humans. It's like that's what's always buzzing in the background, and I like bringing that to the fore.
I don't know to what degree, like, it's just a matter of him appealing to his audience. But I detect, like, there's still in the prose of this text, there's a certain degree of arrogance about what humans are and their relation to the world. Which, again, he may just be kind of like pulling his punches to make this palatable to the reader, because, this is pretty radical stuff. Yeah, it just feels, again, it feels like it's somewhere in between that modern and non-modern ontology.
Just my gut feeling, I actually buy at face value his centering of human subjects. I think that's like a commitment more than it is an oversight, like, because, yeah, in most cybernetics, they have a more sort of developed anti-vitalist ontology that, sees meat machines as a machine among any other. I appreciate his centering of us in the driver's seat. Like, even if, ultimately, systematically, we're not in the driver's seat, as he'll get to towards the end of the book. Like, that's the situation he wants to avoid. It's not something he's unaware of.
Indeed. Okay, so chapter 2 then contains like it's in kind of two halves, right? Like we've this because the title is called Progress and Entropy. And he's going to talk about historical notions of progress and this like thermodynamic entropy thing. And the entropy part is fairly easy, right? That like in thermodynamics, entropy tends to increase, which is basically to say that like systems go from less likely states to more likely states. So a vase sitting on top of a shelf is an unlikely state of affairs. It's pretty rare and it's hard to get there. A vase that's smashed into dust is much more likely in the long run. So over time, left to its own devices, the vase will tend to turn to dust, or accident will just make it turn to dust. Similarly, if you have like two blocks of iron and one of them's really hot and one of them's really cold, over time the heat will pass from one to the other and it'll balance out. So entropy, and this brings us to like in the very end, the kind of heat death of the universe, where everything is just the same temperature and there's no dynamism left anymore. This is a very doomy kind of notion of time and history, right? That order is generally decreasing and things are going on. But then Wiener does point out that this law of thermodynamics only really applies for closed systems, such as the entire universe as a whole, as a single system. But for open systems like the Earth, which receive new energy and information constantly from the sun, this doesn't need to be the case, because there's available energy to build order out of. You can have these islands of order in the general wash of disorder. And he kind of says, well, maybe we accept that. That's fine. We know that the world will not persist forever, but it will persist long enough for us to be happy. And then he goes into a different sort of thing where he can contrast that intellectual pessimism of the the physicist to the kind of emotional euphoria of the American subject, which gets really kind of fascinating. So Kyle, what's this whole segment about?
Yeah, he's kind of talking about like that sunny optimism, the idea of progress forever, the idea of basically like the, America as God's chosen land, that will just kind of prosper forever, which is sort of backed up by, in fact, like he doesn't get into this, but in fact it is backed up by a huge history of colonialism, certain resource arrangements, all kinds of things. But like he's saying that for the average American at this time, the worldview is one in which America is at the center and progress is forever, right? Now, he says that there are actually two aspects to the idea of progress. There's a factual progress, which is essentially like the kind of acceleration that Beer talks about, which we have to cope with, right? Which is the acceleration of invention. Particularly the one driven by capital under capitalism, right? And then we have the ethical idea of progress, which is to create a just world, right? To move towards a more and more perfect world. Now, these don't necessarily coincide with each other, but for your average American at this time, the ideas are considered to be one and the same, right? That the growth of the industrial powers and ingenuity of America is also the growth of ethical order in the world. Now, he says that this is kind of co-emergent with capitalism and colonial conquest. It's quite a narrow phenomenon. And he says also that this view is one that really is quite radically different from prior religious views of the world, sort of like prior eschatologies or other eschatologies. So he says, like, for example, for the Christians, there is the separation of heaven from earth, right? Like prior to the modern era, it was kind of inconceivable. This idea of like heaven on earth is like, no, you go to the next world, and that's where heaven is. It's not this miserable shit we're dealing with here. And he also talks a little bit about the communist struggle to transform the earth into a more perfect world, which he distinguishes from the bourgeois idea of sort of like ingenuity, growing capital, growing ingenuity, growing in this very like I guess what you would call social Darwinist way towards a more perfect world. Like it's an automatic process that is afforded by liberty and ingenuity. It's not a actual struggle beyond numbers go up. So I guess like there's still people, these days who kind of make that liberal argument, right? Like what's that guy Steven Pinker is like a model of the kind of bourgeois thinking that Wiener is criticizing here. And he says that the communist recognition that political struggle is important and actually determines the kind of progress, the kind of match between the factual and the ethical that we arrive at, distinguishes it from what is internalized for the most part in America from bourgeois ideology.
There's a very like interesting thing there that there's a connection that I don't think Wiener explicitly draws, right? But between the two halves of the essay, that the entropy and this like struggle for greater things, right? That like, because the thing with entropy is that like it's when entropy increases, like in that way, like the two blocks transferring heat to each other, that's what is called spontaneous action in a system. That's the action that you expect to happen naturally without anything else interfering. So naturally things cool down, right? Or like spontaneously water will run downhill to a more likely place for it to be. The opposite of spontaneous action is work, where the system does something that's unlikely. And so, like, information and entropy are both related to this concept of, like, surprise and likelihood, and, like, statistical likelihood of things. And so the thing with the lib notion of progress is kind of like this thing of, like, well, spontaneously things just get better. And it's like, no, they kind of don't. Like, thermodynamically, that doesn't happen spontaneously. For order to be restored, or for structure to be created, requires work, which requires a semi-closed system, like a system that's open enough to receive new energy and put it to work, to create things. Because if that's not happening, if you're dealing with a closed system that's just doing its own thing naturally, that system is going to wind down towards heat death. And so, but the difference with the communist vision of progress is that it is active. It is an active process of work to create social structure and cohesion that is greater than what we have, and that if in the absence of that work, what you're going to get is generalized decay. That's the spontaneous action you can actually expect is general decay, not the spontaneous creation of wonderful new things. But he never quite explicitly draws that comparison. I think is what he's trying to get at in general with the chapter, but he doesn't really get there.
Yeah, because it's actually kind of hard to see, like, what. If you're familiar with Stalinism from the period, again, 1950, mustache ain't dead yet, like, communist notions of progress at this time are probably the only sort of, like, parallel you have to something like an automatic notion of progress. And I know it sounds kind of counterintuitive because, well, class struggle is a motor of history, but in Leninism, in Marxist-Leninism in particular, like in a specific reading of Marxism, there is very much a notion of the forces of production, and in particular, the technical instruments of production, having a sense of almost automatic growth throughout history, and class struggle taking on some kind of either epiphenomenal in its worst forms, or in its more defensible forms, a sort of secondary causality within the growth of the productive forces. This is a big matter of consternation in the debates around analytical Marxism, in the interpretation of historical materialism. Does it make sense to talk about this emergent sort of growth in the forces of production over time? And certainly in Stalinism, this is at its highest point of abstraction from the class struggle as, progressive ideology. And I think it should be noted that, American progress ideology at one point did have its roots in struggle, right? And it's sort of gestured to when talking about the virile, Rough Rider kind of Western expansion kind of American progress ideology. But there's a certain point where seeing yourself as an imperialist and a, white supremacist colonizer exits the picture of American self-identity. It becomes obscured. But that is sort of, the rugged individual engine of progress that's behind American notions of progress that gets eclipsed in the 1950s, and that, a lot of conservative America is very upset about this, that notion of the struggle disappearing. And, people are getting too soft now. You forgot our roots. You forgot where we came from. Like, I don't know. Like, I've had this very same conversation with a lot of Foucauldian liberals about, progress. Pff, how could you even use that word? Well, because there is class struggle, there is, struggle in history, and it does, produce something different and sometimes something better in a social system. When you look at the Civil War, you can see both struggle leading to progress, but also, the tendency for modes of production to try to reassert, in the kind of Foucauldian mode, reassert similar types of oppression in new forms. So, like, I don't know, like, it's so amazing that he just sort of slips. Yeah, communists, they're kind of more like these other religious types that don't believe in automatic progress. This is at the height of when that is least true. But, he's still sort of right. Like, there's a notion of progress that communists have that is defensible. You can get progress if you fight for it. And that's something that had disappeared from America because of how awful the fight they were positing was. It's essentially a sort of race war that keeps you pure and, makes, toughens your hands.
Yeah. He also, I think it's more towards the back of the chapter, but he kind of brings it back around to the, capitalist, techno-escalation. That, this progress has required and been on the back of constant invention. But the system is now undermining the basis for invention. And so, the problems we're going to deal with soon, such as environmental collapse, are going to require more invention. And he seems worried that the system is putting itself on a bad footing to continue that kind of invention, if it's undermining its own basis for sustenance.
Yeah, there's a bit of the... again, this reminded me of that Flying Cars and Falling Rate of Profit essay. There's a bit of that sort of Marxist or communist argument for why bourgeois science cannot actually realize the objectives of science or the further development of science because it is restricted by private property, essentially. So it's that argument, and it's been interesting to see how that dynamic has played out in response to the COVID crisis, right?
Is Wiener one of the earlier left accelerationists, except for Marx, in that case?
This was a really common argument by socialists at the time. Not the part about this is a dangerous horizon for our future in terms of our reliance on invention, but the part about the limits of sort of bourgeois society and its relationship to science was a very common argument among socialists in the early 20th century. Wiener's just kind of taking it into this new horizon.
Well, it's a common thing of where are people vested? And the ruling class is vested. The basis of its power is capitalism. And so they need to maintain that as long as they possibly can at any cost, because that's the entire basis of their power and their wealth. You see similar dynamics, maybe even arguably the reason that cybernetics wasn't adopted in the Soviet Union was because, it would have made so many people within the bureaucracy obsolete, and they knew it. So you implement the shittiest version of it. And there, eventually things reach a certain bottleneck where, this is like Marx's point, the only way forward is to basically have a new social system, or because the hard forces of production determinism that you see in Stalinism, it bends the stick and overemphasizes the material aspect of it in order to justify these massive industrialization drives so they can build up a war machine that can be on equal footing with the West. But there is some truth to it in that a change, technological acceleration, if picked up and used for the purposes of a particular class, does move history forward. But without that link up, it doesn't happen. Sort of like how people have pointed out that steam power existed in ancient Greece, but it was just used to change scenery in plays. Right? It was never put to this purpose that transformed the mode of production.
Yeah, absolutely.
So I'm not sure where that was, but yeah. So you eventually you can get this technological progress, and the only way forward is to have it. We'll basically create a new system, and we'll undermine the basis of the power of those who currently have it. And that's why you see the death of maybe the kind of all around, Renaissance man scientist. Not only obviously the increasing complexity of different fields requires specialization. Just because of the time you put into it, you can only master so much because there's only so many hours in the day. But there is also, they want people in their own lane, not thinking about these broader questions of what does society as a whole need from a holistic standpoint, because the implications of that, if you're approaching it from an actual rational scientific way, would be very troublesome to the people currently in power.
Yeah. Just to sort of elaborate on his, incomplete processing of communism, maybe this is more purposeful than I'm giving him credit for, because the way that he characterizes progress ideology is essentially through Lysenkoism and through, like, Lamarckian descriptions of an evolutionary mechanism, where actually it's kind of creepily close to a Marx quote that evolution works in such a way where there's no problem that you get served that can't be solved, and you positively adapt to the solutions available, right? And like in the case of environmentalism, this is still a sort of topic of consternation. A need exists, invention exists. Certainly, we can adapt our inventions towards that need. A sort of Darwinian view of selection says, that ain't necessarily so. But he really drives home that the American progress ideology has at its heart this Lamarckian adaptive kind of faith that because we have a problem, we will find the answer.
So with Lamarck, it's kind of like with Lamarck, the organism and the species are kind of actively propulsed forward, whereas for Darwin, it's not that the living are pushed forward; it's more that the dead are pushed back. That like there's a selection process which pushes down certain adaptations and simply allows others through a sieve. It's just by accident that they go forward. So there's no active propulsion. It's just more like a kind of blind selection process. I wonder, if the bourgeois ideology needs the kind of Lamarckian angle to just kind of believe that things will just improve without them actually needing to create the condition. Like, as in, you can solidify capital in place and keep the commitment to private property, even if it restricts the actual development of society, but you still believe that, things will just go better anyway, even if you're actually the ones who are keeping the clamps down and preventing social progress.
Well, the Lamarckian angle keeps away a kind of dark set of thoughts that Wiener knocks at the door at, but doesn't really... No, he does condemn a certain species of it, but he appeals to the Malthusian influence on Darwin and Wallace, right? But he mainly speaks in glowing terms of Malthus, right? That, that there are some people that want to use Malthus for this weird social Darwinist project, or, that want to use Darwinian theory for this weird social Darwinist project. And certainly Lysenkoism has a corrupt political motivation, but then speaks in glowing terms of Malthus. If you actually kind of historicize Malthus and read, and if you read Marx on Malthus, of course, you understand his class position with, and his appeal to, essentially let the poor's die off, being like the driving function of his work.
Was directly informed the ideology of the East India Company in committing genocide in India.
Right. So the idea that, we're going to critique these things and then think about, and this is where maybe like being a lib humanist does hold him back, right? Instead of being some stripe of Marxist. Like, not being able to kind of take that critique to Malthus is another undigested or underdigested version of this like ideology critique that he's doing. But natural selection is real, and there are virtuous forms of recognizing it, and then there's pernicious, disgusting uses of it. And he's good about naming that kind of political offshoot from people that should know better. But Malthus is strangely shielded from that critique. Just the idea that Malthus is shielded from that critique, and then like American progress ideology is compared to Lysenko, but communists don't have the Lamarckian sort of gene or something. It's just those are a couple of very strange and idiosyncratic moves.
Well, that's it for this episode. Join us again next time for parts 2 and 3 of our discussion of the human use of human beings. In the meantime, you can find us on Twitter at GIUnitPod. We're on Facebook, we're on all the podcast apps, so like, rate, subscribe, all the usual stuff. If you go to patreon.com/generalintellectunit and throw us a couple of bucks a month, you can get access to our community Discord, where we've been hanging out with our community and running weekly reading sessions where we read and discuss Stafford Beer's Brain of the Firm. This show is part of the Emancipation Network, a Marxist podcast network and research collective. Go to emancipation.network and check out our sister shows such as Mortal Science, Jumpsuit Utopia, From Alpha to Omega, and, of course, Swampside Chats. They're wonderful shows and wonderful folks. So until next time, keep your boots clean, your feet out of the swamp, and your head in the revolutionary clouds of tomorrow.